In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Welcome to Journey to Jannah, where timeless wisdom meets the present day. Here we bring you audiobook-style biographies of the greatest minds in Islamic history, scholars, thinkers, and reformers who shaped the course of knowledge, faith, and civilization. From Imam Abu Hanifa to Ibn Sina, from Al-Ghazali to Sayyid Qutb, each story is a journey through trials, triumphs, and unwavering dedication to the pursuit of truth. Sit back, reflect, and let your heart travel through centuries of Islamic heritage. One voice, one story, one lesson at a time. Subscribe now and begin your journey toward knowledge, inspiration, and Jannah, inshallah. Journey to Jannah, where knowledge lives. In the shade of struggle, the life of Sayyid Qutb.
In a quiet prison cell in Cairo, the scent of dust and ink mingled with the weight of silence. A man in his 40s, thin and weary, sat cross-legged on a bare mattress. Before him lay a few scattered pages, his final words, scribbled by hand in the dim light of a flickering bulb. Outside the narrow window, the distant clang of iron and the muted cries of prisoners seemed like the distant beat of war drums. For this was not just any prison. This was the crucible of a revolution, one made not with swords, but with words. Sayyid Qutb, once a celebrated literary critic, now bore the title of revolutionary, theologian, and to some, extremist. How did this cultured intellectual, who once wandered the libraries of New York and admired the poetry of Tagore and Shakespeare, become the man whose writings would shake the foundations of nations? This is not merely the story of a life lived, but of a soul that wrestled with the tides of modernity, faith, power, and justice. His was a journey that began in the serene fields of rural Egypt and ended on the gallows, his neck wrapped not only in a rope, but in history's enduring debate. And so, we begin. At the edge of the Nile, under the burning sun of Upper Egypt, in a place called Musha.
The village of clarity.
Musha, 1906. The Nile flowed like a slow-moving vein through the heart of Egypt, cradling its villages like secrets passed from one generation to the next. One such village, Musha, lay nestled amidst fields of sugarcane and waving palms. The air here was heavy with tradition, but also alive with the quiet hum of thought. It was here, in the spring of 1906, that Sayyid Qutb Ibrahim Hassan Shadhili was born. From the moment he could walk, Sayyid was drawn, not to the games of children, but to the world of books and recitation. His mother, a woman of remarkable intellect and fierce dignity, nurtured in him a love for learning and a deep connection to the Quran. By the age of 10, he had already committed it to memory, the sacred verses echoing in his mind like a heartbeat. His father, though a farmer by trade, was a man of respect in the community, known for his uprightness and justice. From him, Sayyid learned the value of principle, of standing firm even when the winds of pressure blew hard. In those early years, Musha was more than a village. It was a world in miniature, a place where colonial rule hovered just out of view, but whose effects were felt in the cracks of the mud-brick walls and the stories whispered by the elders. Young Sayyid was observant. He watched, he listened, and he questioned. Why did the British rule Egypt? Why did the poor toil while the rich lounged in the shade? Why were the moral fibers of society unraveling before his eyes? As he grew, so too did his curiosity. By 15, he had left for Cairo, driven by an unshakable hunger but even as the city swallowed him in its chaos, the memory of Musha, the quiet clarity of its fields, the strength of his mother's voice during Quranic recitation, remained etched into his soul. He would return many times to visit, but he would never truly belong to the village again. His destiny lay elsewhere, in ink, in ideology, and in the storm of ideas that would one day set the Arab world ablaze.
Scholar with a pen.
Cairo, 1921, 1939. The city pulsed. Cairo was no mere capital. It was a living, heaving being of its own. It breathed through its marketplaces, chanted through its mosques, and dreamed through its universities. For a young Sayyid Qutb arriving from Musha, it was a world both enchanting and alien. He was just 15, gangly and reserved, yet behind his sharp gaze hid a furnace of thought. Enrolled at the Dar al-Ulum, a prestigious institution for training teachers and intellectuals, Sayyid quickly stood out. Not for his charm or charisma, but for the clarity of his mind and the elegance of his Arabic prose. His pen became his weapon, and with it, he carved a place in the literary salons of Egypt. His essays on poetry, social morality, and language captured attention. He admired the likes of. His command of the Arabic language was precise and lyrical, every word placed with intention, every sentence a scaffold for greater ideas. But Sayyid's was not a life of comfort. The city, for all its opportunities, was cruel. He lived modestly, sometimes on the edge of poverty, tutoring wealthy families' children during the day and poring over classical texts by night. Yet he refused to be a man for hire in thought. Even in financial need, he would not compromise his intellectual independence. It was in these years that his soul began its inner battle. On one hand, he was immersed in modernism, drawn to progress, aesthetics, and the evolution of literature. On the other, he was disturbed by the erosion of moral values, especially among the elite. He saw a disconnect between the polished intellectualism of the city and the spiritual emptiness that often accompanied it. The Egypt of the 1930s was a nation awakening. Nationalism, reform, and resistance to British colonialism all surged through its veins. Sayyid contributed not through protests, but through his writings. He penned columns and critiques increasingly focused on the soul of society, the importance of social justice, and the need for ethical transformation. And yet his religious identity during these years was quiet, nearly background. He prayed, but he was not known as a man of dawah. He debated theology, but from a cultural perspective, not a revolutionary one. Islam was, for Sayyid at this stage, a civilization, glorious and noble, but not yet the fiery engine of social overhaul he would later preach. Still, the seeds were being planted. By the late 1930s, the Ministry of Education took note of his growing reputation. He was appointed as an inspector and tasked with overseeing curriculum development. He advocated for educational reform that emphasized both critical thinking and cultural rootedness, pushing back against blind imitation of Western models. But nothing would shake him more or transform him more deeply than the next chapter of his journey. In 1948, the Egyptian government sent him abroad, to the very heart of modernity, to America. He went as a scholar. He returned as a man transformed.
A modernist's dilemma.
America, 1948 to 1950. The ocean voyage was long and uneventful. Sayyid Qutb stood at the railing of the ship, watching the waves churn beneath the sky, his thoughts tangled like the wind in his hair. He carried with him a suitcase, a notebook, and the hopes of a government that had sent him to the United States to study educational systems. But what he carried in his soul was far heavier, an unspoken unease, a quiet questioning of the West's glittering promises. He arrived in New York City, stepping onto American soil with the poise of a scholar and the suspicion of a man whose heart was still tethered to the rhythms of the East. He was 38, already an established intellectual, yet something about this place felt alien, too loud, too brash, too fast. Over the next 2 years, Sayyid would travel through the American landscape, attending classes at Wilson Teachers College in Washington, D.C., visiting schools in Colorado, and observing the pulse of Western society. He wandered through libraries, joined cultural events, and even attended church services. On the surface, he was the ideal envoy, polite, curious, methodical. But beneath his calm demeanor, a storm was beginning to form. At first, he admired certain aspects of the West, their scientific achievements, the orderly systems, the work ethic. But the deeper he looked, the more disturbed he became. He was struck by what he saw as spiritual decay, obsession with materialism, and a casual indifference to morality. The culture seemed built not around the soul, but around desire. He wrote, in his letters, "This is a strange society. Its values are inverted. What they consider freedom is often moral chaos." The turning point came when he witnessed a dance at a church in Greeley, Colorado, a place he had hoped would reflect traditional American values. But there, amidst the glow of the dance floor, he saw what he interpreted as a collapse of modesty and sacredness. For Sayyid, it was not the dancing itself, it was the ease, the triviality, the way it blurred lines of reverence and virtue. He felt a growing alienation. The Western world seemed powerful but hollow, advanced but adrift. And he began to write. Not literary essays this time, but reflections of the heart, critiques laced with theological urgency. He began questioning not only the West, but also Egypt's infatuation. It was here that his ideological transformation began in earnest. America, the land that was supposed to enlighten him, had instead illuminated something else, a conviction that Islam was not merely a religion of rituals, but a complete system of life, a divine alternative to modernity's false promises. By the time he returned to Egypt in 1950, Sayyid Qutb was no longer the soft-spoken literary man from Musha. Something in him had hardened. Something had ignited. He would no longer simply write about Islam, he would live it, and he would fight for it.
Return with a vision.
Cairo, 1950-1953. The air in Cairo had changed. Though still thick with dust and the scent of bread from street ovens, the undercurrent of unrest was unmistakable. The British still loomed large, the monarchy was weak, and whispers of revolution danced through alleyways and cafes. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Sayyid Qutb, newly returned from the United States. He looked older now, leaner, more serious, and no longer dazzled by the modern world. He was not just back from America, he had survived it. What he had seen there, he brought home like a surgeon returning with a diagnosis too grim to soften. He returned not as a cultural observer, but as a man on a mission. At first, he resumed his work with the Ministry of Education, but his tone had changed. He no longer spoke simply about reforming curriculum or improving reading comprehension. He spoke now of a crisis in civilization, a need to awaken an entire society from its moral slumber. He began writing prolifically, turning out essays, lectures, and reflections that would become his earliest steps toward a new Islamic framework. One of his most controversial pieces during this period was a book titled Social Justice in Islam, in which he argued that Islam alone could deliver true justice. Not capitalism, not socialism, not secularism. It was not just a spiritual argument, but a revolutionary one. Islam, he wrote, was not a private religion. It was a comprehensive system, capable of challenging the existing political order. This message drew attention, both from admirers and enemies. And then came the turning point. In 1952, The Free Officers movement, led by a young colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew King Farouk in a military coup. Egypt was reborn as a republic. Streets erupted with joy. Flags waved, guns fired into the air in celebration. And Qutb, like many intellectuals, initially welcomed the change. He even met with Nasser, seeing in him a potential ally in restoring dignity to the Egyptian people. But it didn't take long for Sayyid to see the cracks. The revolution, though promising justice, was rooted in military power, not Islamic principles. The new regime began consolidating control, silencing opposition, and sidelining religion. Qutb realized with growing alarm that nothing had truly changed, only the uniforms. It was around this time that he found himself drawn to a rising Islamic movement, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimun. They were not poets or politicians. They were men of prayer and activism, teachers, preachers, and workers who believed that the Quran should govern all aspects of life. To Qutb, they represented a third way, neither Western secularism nor nationalist militarism, but a return to God, guided by divine law. He didn't join them immediately. He studied them, met with their leaders, attended gatherings in secret. But in their voices, he heard the same yearning that had begun burning in his own soul since America, the desire to build a new society, free from tyranny, corruption, and jahiliyyah, the state of ignorance before Islam. By 1953, Sayyid Qutb officially joined the Muslim Brotherhood, not as a foot soldier, but soon as one of its leading ideologues. He had returned from the West, not just with a vision, but now with a vessel to carry it forward. But the cost of that alliance was still unknown, and the night was only beginning to fall.
The Fire Beneath the Throne.
Egypt, 1953-1954. The door to the Brotherhood's office closed with a quiet thud. Sayyid Qutb sat alone in the corner of the modest room, its walls lined with Qurans, pamphlets, and plans. The air was heavy with the scent of ink and revolution. He ran his fingers over the pages of his latest draft, notes that would soon evolve into a powerful vision for an Islamic society governed not by men, but by divine law. The Brotherhood welcomed him not as a newcomer, but as a voice they had been waiting for. He wasn't a charismatic preacher like Hassan al-Banna had been. He was something else, a theorist, a visionary, the man who would give ideological clarity to a movement in search of direction after the martyrdom of its founder in 1949. In gatherings and circles, Qutb began to speak, not with fiery rhetoric, but with piercing logic and unshakable conviction. He talked of the disease of jahiliyyah, not just as a historical term for pre-Islamic ignorance, but as a living reality infecting the modern world. Any society not governed by the Sharia, he argued, was in a state of jahiliyyah, even if it was called Muslim in name. This was no ordinary critique. It was a revolution in language. His words unsettled even his allies, but many young brothers, especially those disillusioned with politics and power games, flocked to him. They found in Sayyid Qutb a moral absolutism, a kind of spiritual fire that gave them purpose in a darkening age. Meanwhile, Egypt under Gamal Abdel Nasser was shifting rapidly. The revolutionary officer, who had once promised freedom, now grew suspicious of all challenges. The Brotherhood, with its growing influence in mosques, schools, and neighborhoods, became a thorn in the side of the new regime. Sayyid Qutb, though not a military man, became the intellectual thorn beneath the throne. He delivered a fiery lecture at a public meeting in 1953, warning against the state's attempt to control religion and warning of dictatorship dressed in nationalist clothes. He never named Nasser, But the warning was clear. The halls fell silent when he finished. Applause came, cautious and uncertain, but the regime had heard, and it remembered. In 1954, the tension finally snapped. After an alleged attempt on Nasser's life during a public speech in Alexandria, blame quickly fell on the Brotherhood, and the full force of the state followed. Widespread arrests, surveillance, and the closure of offices marked a turning point. The Brotherhood was banned, and its leaders were taken into custody. Sayyid Qutb was among them. He was not involved in any acts of violence, but his writings, clear, provocative, and widely read, had drawn significant attention. Taken from his home, he was imprisoned and placed under harsh conditions. Yet, something unexpected unfolded. Prison did not silence him. It deepened his resolve. Though his health declined, his thinking intensified. It was within those prison walls that Sayyid Qutb began writing what would become his most well-known and influential work, a commentary on the Quran. More than just interpretation, it would be called Fi Zilal al-Quran, in the shade of the Quran, and the world would never be the same again.
In the shade of the Quran.
Egyptian prisons, 1954 to 1964. The cell was narrow, barely wide enough to lie down. A single shaft of light slipped through a barred window, cutting the shadows with quiet defiance. In the silence, distant sounds echoed. Footsteps, the scurry of rats, the groan of damp stone. Yet, in this bleak space, Sayyid Qutb began to write some of the most meaningful words of his life. He sat cross-legged on the cold floor, a worn copy of the Quran before him, a trembling pen in hand. His breathing was labored, strained by chronic illness made worse by hardship. His body bore signs of his confinement, but his resolve remained firm. If anything, it had grown deeper. From that quiet solitude, Qutb began his spiritual and intellectual ascent. He titled his work, Fi Zilal al-Quran, in the shade of the Quran. But it was no ordinary tafsir. This was not simply a scholar's commentary. It was the vision of a man in chains, writing not for scholars in ivory towers, but for believers in the streets, the cells, the deserts. Every verse he touched came alive with urgency. The Quran, he believed, was not a book for the bookshelf. It was a blueprint for life, a revolutionary manifesto for the soul and society alike. And so he explained it not just as a theologian, but as a man seeking to rebuild civilization from scratch. Each chapter brought a message that God alone is sovereign, that no man has the right to legislate against divine law, that a Muslim's loyalty belonged not to flags or nations, but to the Ummah, the global community of believers. He revisited the concept of Jahiliyyah, and now he spoke of it not just as an intellectual error, but as a systemic rebellion against God. Western secularism, Marxism, nationalism, even modern Muslim states, all had become, in his eyes, part of this spiritual ignorance. True Islam had been buried beneath decades of compromise and corruption, and he introduced a new idea, Hakimiyyah, that Allah alone is the true legislator, and any human authority that contradicts divine command is illegitimate. These weren't just words. These were seeds, planted in soil soaked with blood and struggle. Visitors who managed to smuggle out pages from his cell began spreading his writings. Youth in Cairo's underground circles read them by candlelight. Distant sympathizers copied them by hand. Qutb's voice, though silenced behind bars, was growing louder across the Muslim world. But prison also brought pain. Sayyid witnessed fellow inmates tortured to death. He lost contact with family. His sister, Hamida, brought him books and food when she could, hiding tears behind a forced smile. He had no illusions now. The regime did not want to reform him. It wanted to erase him, yet he continued to write. Every page was a rebellion, every verse a hammer against the walls that confined him. He was alone in a cage, but he had found a kingdom in the shade of the Quran. And in this darkness, something else began to form, an idea more dangerous than all the rest. If modern society was Jahiliyyah, if no peaceful reform could revive the Ummah, then perhaps he began to believe a vanguard was needed. A small group of believers, disciplined and pure, who would withdraw from the corrupted society and prepare to establish the rule of God on earth. He never called it a revolution, but the fire beneath his words now whispered, "Let there be change, let there be struggle, let there be jihad."
The Trial of a Thought.
Cairo, 1965-1966. The courtroom was thick with the weight of judgment. Uniformed guards flanked every wall. Journalists scribbled. Foreign diplomats whispered. And in the center stood a man, not trembling, not defensive, but calm, like a mountain, weathered by years of storm. Sayyid Qutb, now in his late 50s, stood trial not just for conspiracy, but for something far more dangerous: thought. The regime accused him of plotting to overthrow the government, training secret cells, and preparing for an armed uprising. They said he was the brain behind a new Brotherhood conspiracy. But the evidence, as even many observers admitted, was thin. No weapons had been found. No orders had been given. What they had were his words, milestones, in the shade of the Quran. His prison writings, his manifestos, his vision of a society governed by divine law. The prosecutor raised them like weapons, quoting excerpts as if they were explosives. Sayyid Qutb stood unflinching. He did not deny his beliefs. He did not ask for mercy. He did not claim innocence in the way they wanted. Instead, he affirmed the very ideas they feared. "Indeed, our words remain dead until we die for them," he told the court. "Only then do they begin to live." To some, it was a confession. To others, it was martyrdom spoken in prose. Behind the scenes, offers were made. Nasser's regime, seeking legitimacy in the Arab world, feared turning Qutb into a symbol. International figures appealed for clemency. Even personal emissaries approached Sayyid's family with a message. Let him write a letter, a request for pardon. That is all. But Qutb refused. To ask for mercy was to deny the truth he had lived and written. To plead would be to say his beliefs were wrong. He would not betray his words, not now, after all that he had endured. On August 29th, 1966, just before dawn, the state executed Sayyid Qutb by hanging. No last speech, no public spectacle, only a hushed silence as the rope was fastened. But his death was not the end. From that silence, 1,000 voices rose. His books were banned, but they spread. His name was erased from official memory, but etched into the hearts of a new generation. To some, he became a martyr of truth. To others, a dangerous ideologue whose ideas would echo far beyond what even he had imagined. In the dark cell, Sayyid Qutb had planted milestones. Now, they were no longer his alone.
Legacy, the echo of ideas.
Across the Ummah and beyond, 1966-6. Present. They buried him quietly, without ceremony, in a state cemetery. But the man they lowered into the earth that morning in 1966 did not vanish. Sayyid Qutb lived on, not in body, but in ink, not in voice, but in the rhythm of revolution and revival that would echo through the decades. His book milestones, once scribbled by candlelight in a prison cell, became a beacon for those who saw no path forward except through resistance. In the slums of Cairo, the universities of Indonesia, the deserts of Algeria, the streets of Tehran, and even in the prisons of Saudi Arabia, his words were read, debated, memorized. Some read him as a spiritual guide who reminded Muslims of the need to center their lives around the Quran. Others saw him as a strategist, offering a new framework for how oppressed believers could challenge illegitimate power. And a few, a dangerous few, read him as a call to arms. His idea of jahiliyyah, once a metaphor for spiritual ignorance, was reinterpreted by extremists as a license to declare war on Muslim rulers. His vision of a vanguard inspired groups that would later take up arms in pursuit of an Islamic state. Though Qutb never called for the bloodshed that would follow, his language, radical, urgent, uncompromising, was used by those who sought justification. From the Muslim Brotherhood's intellectual reformers to the militants of Al-Qaeda, and even among modern-day Islamists and Salafi jihadists, Sayyid Qutb's fingerprints remained. His legacy became a battlefield of its own. Some blamed him. They said he planted the seeds of modern extremism, that he confused revival with revolution, purity with isolation, belief with division. Others defended him. They said his ideas were distorted by those who came after him, that his true mission was spiritual awakening, not violence. But even among critics, there was no denying his influence. He had dared to ask hard questions. What does it mean to truly submit to God? Can a Muslim live fully in a secular system? Is Islam just personal piety or a comprehensive way of life? These were questions that had no easy answers, but he had forced a conversation that would never again be silenced. In Egypt, his name is still whispered, some with reverence, others with fear. His books, banned then smuggled, still pass from hand to hand in the quiet of mosques and study circles. In academic halls, he is studied as a towering figure in Islamic political thought. In prisons, his words still inspire, and in the hearts of millions, Sayyid Qutb remains a symbol of conviction, of sacrifice, of a pen sharpened not for applause, but for truth. He did not die a general, or a president, or a wealthy cleric. He died with chains on his wrists, but freedom in his heart. A single man, a single book, a single rope. And from that silence, the world has never stopped hearing his voice.
Alhamdulillah for joining us on this journey through the life of one of Islam's great scholars. We hope this story inspired your heart and deepened your connection with the rich legacy of Islamic knowledge. If you found benefit in today's episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Journey to Jannah, your home for Islamic biographies, wisdom, and timeless guidance. New episodes are uploaded regularly, so turn on the notification bell to never miss a moment of insight. May Allah increase us all in beneficial knowledge and guide us on the path of the righteous. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.